Breaking news from Ottawa this hour. John McCallum, one of the Prime Minister's most experienced Liberal allies, has resigned as Canada's ambassador to China. McCallum, a former cabinet minister, got into hot water with Justin Trudeau for remarks he made this week about the case of Meng Wanzhou. She's the Chinese tech company executive who was detained in Vancouver under an extradition request from the U.S. The CBC's Katie Simpson is in our Ottawa bureau. Katie, what do we know so far?
Let's be clear with some of the language here. He was fired. This is not a resignation. He was outright fired by the Prime Minister. And I cannot stress how big a deal this is, given the critical state of the Canada-China relationship. Earlier this week, calls emerged for John McCallum's resignation as ambassador to China after he held a news conference with mainly Chinese language media, or media outlets that had a mainly Chinese audience, where he offered some very candid remarks about Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive that Canadian officials arrested on December 1st at the request of the U.S. The U.S. has accused her of violating sanctions laws and had put in an extradition request for her. He weighed into that debate and said that he essentially, over a 40-minute news conference, advocated for her release, saying it would not be a happy outcome if she were to be extradited to the United States, and went even further to argue that she had a pretty good case, laying out the arguments her lawyer could use to have a successful case against the Americans. Now, 24 hours after those comments gained traction in the English language media, a statement from the Prime Minister's office that was attributed to John McCallum said it was all a mistake. It said, "I misspoke." But then again, on Friday, reporters caught up with him at another event in Vancouver, and it was the Toronto Star that put some questions to him, and he again weighed in on this issue. And so after that, we got a statement today from the Prime Minister's office, and we can pull that up right now for our viewers. The Prime Minister's office says, "Last night, I asked for and accepted John McCallum's resignation as Canada's ambassador to China. For almost 2 decades, John McCallum has served Canadians honorably with distinction. I thank him and his family for his service over the past many years." John McCallum was put in as ambassador to China in early 2016 after Donald Trump had been elected, and there was a significant change in Justin Trudeau's cabinet. It's when he put Chrystia Freeland in as Foreign Affairs Minister to essentially manage that relationship. He also put John McCallum, one of his most experienced politicians, one of his most experienced allies, in that role as ambassador to China, because from his government position, from the Liberal government position, Justin Trudeau has made it very clear he wants to strengthen ties with China, and he wants to encourage more business growth between Canada and China, as this Trudeau government sees this as a massive economic opportunity. But this is not the first time that Justin Trudeau had to defend or that John McCallum had gotten into trouble. About a year ago, he had made some comments while in China that Canada has more in common with the current Chinese regime than with the Americans right now under the administration of Donald Trump. So this is not the first time John McCallum has been in hot water, but again, the breaking news today, John McCallum, Canada's ambassador to China, has been fired at one of the most difficult moments in the Canada-China relationship.
And we know, Katie, that this controversy really reached a boiling point, certainly when these comments by McCallum were made earlier in the week. And so there's been a lot of reaction also so far. What have we seen on that front?
There have been significant calls for John McCallum to have been fired earlier this week. Once those comments picked up, his earlier comments picked up in the English language media and started to really gain some traction. Andrew Scheer, the leader of the opposition, called for him to be fired. We also heard from other former ambassadors who said it appeared that McCallum had gone rogue and that the government should start looking to transition him out of this role. But moments after the news release came out from the Prime Minister's office saying that McCallum had indeed been fired, opposition leader Andrew Scheer held a news conference on Parliament Hill. Here's what he had to say.
Well, it's clear that Justin Trudeau has been incredibly weak on this issue. He should have shown leadership right from the beginning and fired his ambassador. Instead, he's allowed different messages to be delivered on different days through different media, causing further damage to Canada's reputation and our ability to handle this very important case.
The Prime Minister was asked when he was out on doing some visits to the East Coast. He was asked, does John McCallum are you going to punish him? Does he maintain your confidence? And when the Prime Minister was asked mid last week, he said that, it's not going to help get those two Canadians out any faster if we make a change in Beijing. And so clearly, whatever has happened since Justin Trudeau made those comments, something significant enough has happened. And quite possibly, it's likely those comments to the Toronto Star that were made yesterday.
And now for more on this story, we've reached out to Charles Burton. He's a former Canadian diplomat to China and a professor of Canada-China relations at Brock University. He joins us now from St. Catharines, Ontario. Hello to you, Charles.
Hi.
All right, so let's begin with your reaction to this news.
Well, it's certainly unprecedented in my memory for a prime minister to publicly fire a sitting ambassador from his post. But Mr. McCallum's ill-considered statements about Ms. Meng, I think, did affirm for the Chinese regime that their policy of arbitrarily arresting Mr. Kovrig in Mr. Favor and threatening to execute Mr. Schellenberg was, in fact, effectively putting pressure on the government of Canada. And so, really, Mr. Trudeau didn't have much choice but to let Mr. McCallum go when he persisted in making statements that affirmed the Chinese position that the Canadian government had made an error in making Ms. Meng stay in Canada pending the extradition. And, basically, we can see in retrospect that Mr. McCallum's knowledge of China, the incompatibility of their economic and political system with our democracy, really showed in his inability to effectively manage the current crisis in Canada-China relations.
And you reference that current crisis, and certainly that's where I'd like to ask you the next question in terms of actually taking this sort of action in the middle of such a delicate and complex situation between Canada and China right now. What could be the potential fallout? How does this further damage those relations?
Well, I think it sends out a clear signal to the Chinese government that the Canadian government's position is clear and consistent, and that Mr. McCallum's independent statements were not reflective of a split within our leadership with regard to the Meng matter. We continue to see this as fulfilling the terms of the Canada-US extradition treaty, which we're following to the letter. It is not a politicized matter. And the main issue and the main cause of this is that China gave Ms. Meng permission to come to Canada when there was an outstanding warrant for her arrest in the United States. And they should have known full well that we have an extradition treaty with the United States, which leaves us with no choice but to arrest her if the United States requests that we do.
And now we know that Prime Minister Trudeau, as we mentioned, he requested that resignation from John McCallum on Friday night. So how difficult would it have been for him to keep McCallum on as ambassador?
Well, I think that, Mr. McCallum made some statements to the Chinese media exclusively. So Chinese language media from both China and the Chinese language media here in Canada were getting a message from Mr. McCallum, not in the Chinese language, which he doesn't really understand, which was different from the messaging that was being given out by Minister Freeland and our Prime Minister. So it was puzzling that he would hold a press conference at which only Chinese language media would be invited. Surely our government has one position on this matter for non-speakers of Chinese and for speakers of Chinese, so all the media should have been there. So I think certainly, doing this and then persisting in his ill-considered statements with regard to the desirability of the United States withdrawing its request for extradition of Ms. Meng made it impossible for him to continue. Now, we have a lot of people in Ottawa in the Global Affairs Department who have excellent knowledge of China and can, I think, very effectively further Canadian interests in this matter. And in the meantime, the Chargé d'Affaires in Beijing will be engaging with the Chinese counterparts on getting Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Favor the justice of a due process of law and hopefully freedom very soon. And I would expect that the Prime Minister will appoint a special envoy to go to Beijing and engage with the Chinese government at a very high level to get this matter moving now that Mr. McCallum is no longer able to fulfill that function.
And now, Charles, I just have one final question for you here. In terms of the actual statement that was issued by the Prime Minister's office, it doesn't make any reference to the comments that were made by McCallum, to the further report that came out just a few days ago regarding the extradition process with Meng Wanzhou from John McCallum. He just cites basically how experienced McCallum is and that he requested for the resignation. What do you make of the fact that there is no direct correlation in this statement to the comments that were made with the now former ambassador to China?
Well, it's pretty clearly implied, I think, for me and most Canadians, that Mr. McCallum's career has ended unhappily due to errors of judgment on his part. But, one does feel some sympathy that he's leaving under a cloud, but that cannot completely, discredit him from the great accomplishments and contributions to Canada that he has made in his career. And so I think the Prime Minister's statement was correct by not explicitly making it worse than it already is.